Hi guys, John Heath here again for Milton Rose Learning with another great Let's Learn lesson on Othello characters. Okay, so it's all a case of kind of tragedy when we look at one of Shakespeare's masterpieces here today. So we're going to start by looking at a quick who's who, just give you a very nice overview of the key characters within the text. Then for the high grades, we're going to be breaking down those characters for audience response. So looking at the Jacobean audience and how they would respond to these characters, but also then juxtaposing that with a modern or audience response, because they sometimes look at the characters in very different ways, and that's very good for, to note for your essays. And then we'll finish by looking at a nice character arc for Othello himself, look at some turning points and what he's like tragically at the end of the narrative. Okay then, so if we dive in then, we'll give you a quick who's who, just to start you off. So firstly then, if we take Othello then. So Othello, as we probably know, is a noble and respected Moorish general. He's a North African kind of general in the Venetian army. So he's secretly married to Desdemona because of kind of racial prejudice and things like that. He might not be allowed, and he represents the outsider in a prejudiced society. And also the tragic vulnerability of honourable men who are prone to manipulation. So he's a very thematically dense character there. But the main overarching characteristic for him is his North African kind of dark-skinned character in a society that was heavily racist and was normally run by white people. So in that sense, Othello is kind of on the back foot and kind of gets manipulated. And it's primarily a play about race explored through Othello. Then we have Iago, okay, a very, very unpleasant character, hence the snake emoji. So Iago is Othello's kind of understudy almost, who schemes to ruin him after being passed over for promotion. So he represents manipulation, deceit, and the danger of hidden malice. You really don't want to get on Iago's bad side, let's put it that way. Then we have a very tragic character, Desdemona. So Desdemona is Othello's loyal and innocent wife, but she's wrongly accused of having an affair of infidelity. And she represents purity and honesty and the vulnerability of women in a deeply patriarchal or male-dominated society. She struggles to kind of get her voice heard in this play because of the patriarchal norms in this period. Then we have Emilia. So Emilia is Iago's wife and Desdemona's maid. And she ultimately exposes Iago's deceit. Very important narrative point there. She represents female strength then because of that, moral awakening and the overlooked voice of truth. Okay, so she does actually fulfill a very powerful narrative function in this play by exposing Iago's deceit. Then we have Cassio. Here he is, looking very serious. So Cassio is Othello's loyal lieutenant, but is demoted after Iago orchestrates a drunken brawl. Okay, so he's kind of down-ranked because of that. But he nevertheless represents honour, reputation and professional integrity, which is severely lacking in this play. So he's a very nice character in that sense, and he offsets all the deception and manipulation that's flying around in the play. Then we have Roderigo. So Roderigo is a foolish nobleman who's in love with Desdemona, and he ends up getting manipulated by Iago, but then again, who doesn't in this play? And he demonstrates how jealousy can ultimately lead to self-destruction and self-denial. Okay. Then we have, lastly down here, Bianca. So Bianca is a courtesan who is in love with Cassio, and she's often dismissed and mocked and seen as kind of lightweight almost. And she represents then social class in this, which was very important in this era, and gender prejudice. Even though she's very loyal, she's still treated unfairly. Okay, and that patriarchy really plays itself out through Bianca as well. So that's the kind of quick kind of who's who of the main characters within this play. So now then, let's kind of drill down a little bit more and get a little bit more out of these characters. Now, it's very important, if I was teaching your class at school, then I would be breaking down the audience responses to these characters in terms of the Jacobean audience, so about 500 years ago, and the modern audience, because a lot of the time they will see characters very differently, because a modern audience, our consciousness has evolved. We've had feminism, we've had gender equality, patriarchy is kind of dying a death now, so we see things in very different ways. So that leads us to kind of look at characters in very different perspectives, and it's great for you when you write your essays and in the exam to differentiate between the different audiences. So let's do it then. So we've put together a nice table for you, and we'll just go through one by one together and we'll break them down. So first off, we have Othello, as we know. So how does the Jacobean audience respond? Well, let's think about that first. The Jacobean audience would struggle with issues of race. They saw kind of the African kind of men as not as effective or not as good as the white men in some ways. So they kind of see his downfall as it just confirms their fears about racial and cultural difference. They would really struggle with understanding kind of African characters in these plays, and they go, oh, well, it's because they're not as good as us, so that's why he suffers his tragic downfall. So therefore, an inherent kind of racist interpretation would be the norm in Jacobean kind of society when they looked at Othello. However, thankfully, things have changed. So a modern interpretation then of Othello is much more sympathetic. So we live in the era of multiculturalism and things like that. So we would view Othello now as a tragic victim of racism and a racist society and manipulation. It was not his fault, and it definitely wasn't down to his race, his tragic downfall. It was down to characters like Iago manipulating the hell out of the situation. So we see him now in a much more positive light, and that really illustrates the differences between a Jacobean audience and a modern audience. Okay. Then we have Iago. There he is, looking very sinister with his candles on. Okay, so a Jacobean audience then, they would see him as a horrifying symbol of evil, because they were heavy Christians in this period. So he's acting in a very immoral, evil way. Degeneration and also the fear of the unknown, almost someone waiting in the shadows, waiting to stab you in the back. And a modern audience would be very similar, but we've had years and years of psychoanalysis now through Sigmund Freud. So we would see him almost as a manipulative sociopath. That's a very good word for you to research and drop into your essays if you're talking about Iago. And a symbol maybe of what we would call toxic masculinity in today's era. So we flip the reading slightly there and look at the psychological aspects of Iago. Then we have Desdemona. So a Jacobean audience would pity her for her innocence, but they'd also criticise her for defying her father, and she married Othello when it was, an interracial couple in this period would have been very, very strange, and the Jacobeans wouldn't have been able to understand it, and they would have thought, well, she kind of not deserved it, but it was understandable, her tragic end, because she didn't follow her father. However, a modern interpretation is much more sympathetic. So Desdemona would be admired for her independence, and she's been wronged by societal misogyny. Misogyny is a very interesting word. It means kind of women hating society. So she was a symptom of that within Jacobean society, and she needs to be pitied and sympathised with. Then we have Emilia. So a Jacobean audience would dwell on her disobedience and outspokenness and see them as very unsettling. She shouldn't be going against her husband Iago, even though her husband was a monster. But the Jacobeans were very into their marriage, and it was very important that you follow the man. So they would have negative impressions of Emilia. However, again, in a modern interpretation, much more sympathetic. So she would be celebrated as a proto-feminist voice against male injustice. We've had decades of feminist theory now, and it's changed our perspective on female characters. So she gets a much better interpretation from a modern audience. Then we have Cassio, and in the Jacobean he would be respected as a courtly gentleman. Despite his flaws, he plays by the rules and he doesn't try and rock the boat too much, and he would be respected by the Jacobeans because of that. However, a modern interpretation is a little bit more negative actually. He would be seen as very naive and complicit in male-dominated structures. He's not actually kind of trying to change the world in any way or make it better, and that's a real kind of negative point for a modern audience. Then Roderigo, Jacobean audience, he would be mocked as very foolish and an easily led follower. He needs to develop a brain of his own almost from a Jacobean perspective. But modern interpretation, he might be pitied as a pawn in Iago's scheme. He's almost like a pawn on a chessboard being moved around by Iago. And again, is he a victim of Iago's toxic masculinity and his own a little bit? Probably, if truth be told. So I think, yeah, the modern interpretation is slightly more sympathetic towards him. Then Bianca at the end. So Jacobean interpretation would see Bianca probably as immoral and untrustworthy due to her courtesan status. It was like seen as a bit of a shady kind of profession in that sense, and they were Christians, so it kind of cut against their Christian beliefs. But a modern audience would be a bit more sympathetic and see her as mistreated and to be pitied really, because she's a marginalised female character who can't really have her own voice in the narrative. So as you can see there, the Jacobean audience and the modern audience, sometimes they lead to very radically different interpretations of the characters. Very important for you to understand that if you want to get the high grades. Okay, now let's round off by having a really nice look at a good character arc. And if Othello comes up in your exam, then this should be quite helpful. So we're going to do a character arc for Othello then. So let's line it up nicely so we can have a good look at this together. Okay, so what's he like at the start of the text? Well, let's have a look. So Othello defends himself before the Senate, and Othello calmly explains how he won Desdemona's love through stories of his life, not magic, because they, you know, again, it's a racist society, so they think he's almost like a wizard for kind of getting a white person to marry him. And the characterization then shows Othello as noble, very articulate and composed. He's respected for his honour. Despite being an outsider, he's still kind of respected, which was unusual in this period. And the quote when he's defending himself is, he says, "She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them." So it was almost a meeting of minds and a meeting of hearts. It's a very beautiful kind of speech, and he really kind of shows that the Jacobeans believe that the kind of Africans were a little bit savage and not civilized, and that's just not true, because he gives a beautiful speech in front of the Senate there. Okay, and then what's the turning point? If you're in my class, I will be talking now about turning points. So the turning point for me for Othello is when he actually strikes Desdemona. So let's unpick that together. So in a fit of jealousy, Othello hits Desdemona in public, which is still shocking today. But in Jacobean eras as well, that would play into all these racial stereotypes of barbarism and things like that. And it shocks those around him. So the characterization, it marks his moral decline because it's a big no-no, and he's, you know, attacking women and things like that, and he's playing into Jacobean racial stereotypes there. And Othello becomes irrational and violent, and he's consumed by misplaced honour and betrayal. Okay, and the quote that you'd really want to learn there is, "I took you for that cunning whore of Venice, which falsehood hath made me." Okay, so he's kind of using very offensive language towards Desdemona, and it shows he's almost dehumanising her in some way, and it's the start of the moral deterioration of Othello throughout the play. And then if we follow the character arc to its logical conclusion, the tragic conclusion, Othello has again a very good final speech at the end. So let's get a grip on that. So realizing the truth too late, Othello kills himself beside Desdemona's body after he's killed her, I should say. So the characterization shows Othello as tragically self-aware. He seeks to restore honour, but he's broken by guilt and grief and what he's done. And it's like, oh, you know, Iago has done his work and got him to do the nasty kind of dirty work. And the quote is a really good quote. I kissed thee ere I killed thee. No way but this. Killing myself to die upon a kiss. Okay, very tragic juxtaposition or oxymoron there. Die upon a kiss at the end. Very, very tragic. And that seals the end of Othello's narrative arc within the play. Okay, so let's just sit back for a second and get three big takeaways from this kind of from this lesson. Now, I think the first one is you really need to think about the differences between the Jacobean audience and the modern audience and how they interpreted those characters. So I'd probably be watching that part of the video again just to really let that sink into my mind and make sure that all of that theory can then be teased out in your essays, because it really will push your marks up. Then I would be thinking about the character arc of Othello, because we've given you a brief one there, but there's many more turning points and there's many more dramatic narrative kind of events that happen to him throughout the play. So I'd be plotting that, because Othello can come up a lot, and I'd probably be doing that for all the other characters as well. Also as well, I would be reflecting maybe on some of the theory around women and feminist interpretations of this play, because Desdemona is a very interesting character from a feminist theory, a feminist perspective, about how she's been kind of mistreated by Jacobean interpretations of her, but a more modern interpretation is much more sympathetic, not only to her, but to her husband Othello as well. So those would be really good points to reflect on. Okay, right, so as always, if you found this lesson useful, please hit the like, subscribe, tap the bell icon, tell all your friends, tell everybody that you know to grow the channel. And please keep your eyes peeled for Milton Rose Learning's YouTube channel, because we drop quality content pretty much every week. And it just remains to say after that, as always, keep learning, keep growing, and we'll see you soon.